This is Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski.
There is a reason cases like Bryan Kohberger captivate the public like they do. It's not just the crime, it's about what's going on behind the crime, the mind behind the crime, if you will. How does someone go from studying criminology to being accused of one of the most gruesome mass murders in recent history? What role, if any, does mental health play in shaping a person capable of such acts? With new revelations about Kohberger's psychiatric and medical records, we may be getting closer to understanding his psychological makeup. While Idaho law doesn't allow an insanity defense, those records could have a huge impact on sentencing, determining whether he receives life in prison or a firing squad. What could we learn from those records? Could they confirm early struggles with undiagnosed mental illness, or do they tell a different story? And does it matter? One of the things we're very aware of is his methodical actions. Today, we're joined by psychotherapist and author Shavaun Scott, who specializes in criminal psychology and understanding the minds behind violent crime. Shavaun, when we're looking at a case like Kohberger here, particularly with the emergence of medical and psychiatric records, which now are in the hands of the prosecution, what are the key things you'd look for in assessing someone's mental state at the time of a crime like this?
Well, the thing that carries weight in a court is, was the person psychotic? Were they having delusions and hallucinations that rendered them unable to know what they were doing, or they had no idea that what they were doing was wrong? I don't think we're going to see that in this case. You know, this is the MO of a sexual domination serial killer, and those guys are not psychotic. It's a very different kind of animal. They're typically people who have a severe personality pathology, but they hide it, and they can often function very well in life, and so they don't meet the criteria for a severe mental illness that would, mean that they were not held legally responsible for what they did.
I can't imagine that they're going to go down a route, like we've assumed maybe they should with like a Lori Vallow Daybell or something,
Right.
which they just can't because of Idaho law there. They could not go down that road there. And I can't imagine they're going to go down that road here. I mean, if she doesn't meet the criteria, I don't know what does, quite honestly.
Right.
But is it something that can be brought up? Is this something that you think may be presented in court in the terms of the actual trial itself, or do you think this may be something that's brought more into play when it comes to sentencing, if we get to sentencing, if in fact he's found guilty?
Yeah, I would anticipate that it would come up during sentencing as an attempt to mitigate any possible death penalty, which I think is a very good, strong possibility here. So they're going to look at everything and anything that they can possibly use that they think is going to sway the jury in his favor.
I mean, ultimately, there is evidence, there is information out there about kind of his own state by his own admissions online. We found some of that way early on from the visual snow, I think is what he called it. Maybe I'm incorrect, but it was some.
No, you're correct.
Yeah, visual snow, and really feeling a disconnect from his family. In his own writings, allegedly, if they are in fact his, it talks about realizing at a very early age in his teens of noticing life changing from having a connection to family members and feeling love and feeling connection. And I'm just paraphrasing here, but to just emptiness and being in those situations, being surrounded by people where you should feel those things because you've done it in the past, but like something's just gone and it's not there anymore. What exactly is that's going on with someone? Not to say that that's a defense by any means, but help me understand better what's happening with someone if in fact they're recognizing that.
Right. It is super hard to know without, extensive interviewing with someone like this. So we're really going on things that he wrote years ago online. and trying to make suppositions based upon that. You know, a couple things that have been mentioned that looked reasonable based upon his online postings: schizotypal personality, which is a person that just is detached. They don't get close to other people. And even though they may have some awareness that they're different, they are not really driven to try to change that. It's just sort of the way that they're baked. It's the way they turn out, and sometimes that does appear in adolescence. The other thing is OCD. You know, he was reportedly a germaphobe. Certainly in his writings about his diet, he had very obsessive tendencies, and that kind of personality trait, you know, we don't know if he met full criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder, but serial killers often are very obsessive. That's why they think about violence all the time. That's why they plan what they do. You certainly see that with Huerman and his, you know, spreadsheets. Um, so OCD would be something that we would expect, but in no way would that mitigate his responsibility for committing a murder or murders.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it comes down to. I mean, it's one thing to kind of, like I always say, understand the recipe, but it certainly, there is personal accountability, without a doubt, for anybody. And I guess that's where it's interesting with people like this. Of are they capable of controlling this sort of thing? Again, not to in any way dismiss it or say he's not accountable. He is. But when we really break it down on that level, if your brain works like this, can you snap it out of it? Can you work away from it, or is this just kind of like, this is the path you're going to go down?
You know, there are two philosophies, and they're both polar opposites. One is that we are not really responsible for anything we do, because with our, and there are people I respect very much in neuroscience who believe that say, because based upon their genetics and based upon their environment and all the social factors, they were just basically preordained to commit the crime that they committed. Therefore, is anybody ever responsible? Does anybody ever get punished? You know? And then there's the other extreme, you know, where people are responsible for everything, even when they've had head injuries, even when they've been severely abused. Hold them accountable. You know, if they deserve death, give them death. I'm probably somewhere in the middle with those things, and I think most of us are. We realize that some people came into the world with some bad genes, you know, and then they had a head injury, and then they were abused, and it's like you can see there was a trajectory here where this person really was set up for committing violence. Does that mean that they don't go to prison for it? I don't think so, because I look at it as there are cars with faulty braking systems. That makes them dangerous. And what do? We just need to remove them from society. So it's not really about punishment for me as much as it is keeping everybody else safe. But you can look at it from different philosophical lenses, and it's you know, it's another one we could sit around and debate about it.
Sure.
Over dinner sometime.
Yeah, you know, you're exactly right. Substance abuse did play a role in his life as well. We know he was a heroin addict for several years, from what I understand, allegedly. Basically, you know, self-medicating himself. How does something like that then affect, assuming there's already this inherent thing going on in his brain, does that exacerbate the problem? Does it alleviate it for a certain amount of time? I mean, obviously, a lot of times when people self-medicate, they're trying to alleviate their pain of what their brain is doing to them. How does that affect what maybe we'd seen here?
Yeah, it's hard to say, but you know, heroin, alcohol, these are downers. These are things that help people relax. And we can look at 2/3 of the country right now and say they're all self-medicating, if not 3/4 of the country.
Sure.
You know, everybody's having their wine at dinner or their beer after work, and everybody's trying to moderate their mood state in some way. So it would make sense that if a person is really tense, really uptight, really has an obsessive personality, that heroin would feel pretty good to them. and that maybe when he went off heroin, those obsessions got worse. He became more angry, more agitated, more irritable, and that's been reported as well, that he had that shift after, you know.
Hmm.
So it's speculative, but it's certainly interesting and complicated to try to take somebody like this apart and make sense of everything that they were experiencing. I don't think we can say this is a guy who had an abuse history. He seemed to come from a very normal, fine family.
Hmm.
And these folks, what we know about them, you know, the sexually dominating killers, they start with those kind of fantasies really young in life, 8, 9 years old. They're thinking about it.
Hmm.
And even though they don't have a history of violence, usually they don't, these
Hmm.
kind of folks.
Yeah.
They're not impulsive in that way, like the guy that goes out and gets in bar fights or road rage kinds of things. They don't typically do that, but they've got a really active fantasy life that goes on for years before they act out on those fantasies.
I mean, and his parents, from what we know, and we're just really speculating here based on kind of what we've heard and what's been speculated on, especially like in Howard Blum's book about the case, about folks who, you know, allegedly were friends with some of the family. You know, the family, from what we understand, kind of suspected. Yeah, he may be capable of doing something like this, which would be a weird thing to think about your kid. If you're like, oh, yeah, wonder if my brother did that. He has the same sort of car. I mean, those are some of the allegations that have been made. When a family recognizes that, or like that's their reaction, what does that say about what they knew about him? And in no way am I saying like they could have prevented this, but I mean, what kind of warning signs, you know, are there where that's in the back of someone's mind, and you're not going to be shocked if, yeah, the loved one that you have in your life, you're not shocked when they maybe are accused of doing something like this.
It's really so telling when parents often come forward in cases where there's been some kind of extreme violence and say, we always knew he was different. We always knew he had struggles. We always knew he was not comfortable with women, and maybe even expressed having anger or hatred toward women. It happens a lot where parents, you know, see this stuff. Sometimes they normalize it because they just say, well, this is how he is. He's always been different that way. But he's a good guy. He would never do anything terrible. And then you find parents who are a bit more insightful, or sisters who are more insightful, who see that, you know, these are the red flags of somebody who's potentially dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, that's it got to be a hard thing just in general as a sister, as a brother, as a father, as a mother, whatever it may be, to kind of accept that of you know, the person that you care about, the person that's part of you.
Totally.
That
Totally.
that oh my God, how could they be thinking this sort of way? What does it tell us about his interest in the criminology field? And I mean, he was not a dumb guy. I mean, he was, you know,
No.
finishing up his PhD, and you know, he certainly, you know, went through the path of being educated on this.
Yeah.
You know, what does that tell us about any of this?
Yeah, that's another thing that makes me think he's not very likely at all to be psychotic, because you couldn't have the academic focus that this guy obviously had if you were having delusions and hallucinations, you know, so I don't think he's psychotic. But the interest in criminology and criminality is very common among people who commit mass murder or serial killers. They study other killers. They want to understand the criminal mind. Sometimes there may be a drive to understand themselves, but often it's, how do I get away with it? How do I become a better criminal? So that does not surprise me. There have been some that worked in law enforcement, and many that studied it.
And that's an interesting thing with this, because when he was studying at DeSales, I believe it was, when he put out a research project, he was asking very specific questions of people. And I don't know that it was odd. I mean, to the average person who's not in that field, it feels a little creepy and weird, where it's, and I'm just paraphrasing, but like, how did you feel when you committed your crime? Like what was going through your mind? It was almost, it felt, now that we have the full picture, of the allegations against him, like almost a guidebook to how he should process the potential crime he was, maybe pondering committing at that point in time.
Yeah, looking for a peer group almost. You
Yeah.
could certainly put that spin on it. Those kind of questions are when you're studying forensic psychology, those are the kinds of things that you're interested in. And when you start doing interviews with people who have done awful crimes, murder or other things, those are the questions you ask them. What was going on in your head? What were the precursors? What were you thinking while you did it? How did you feel after you did it? So the questionnaire in and of itself seems pretty normal for that field of study. But yeah, in hindsight, there's a creepy element to it. What was he getting out of this emotionally? And was this meeting some kind of need for him?
Yeah, that's the weird part about all of it. Where was this all going? Was this strictly just part of his studies, and then somehow this crime kind of came about? I mean, let me ask you that. I mean, and this is just obviously pure speculation, but where does one go from, being a criminology student? You're excelling in your craft. Obviously, he wasn't very good at teaching. He got fired for that. But he was on a path where, had he or allegedly not been accused of these crimes or committed these crimes, would likely end up working somewhere in that field. Where does someone go astray like that to get so obsessed with something that it would drive you to commit these crimes? Because from what we know, he did not necessarily know these people very well at all. There was some sort of connection probably to target. I can't imagine he just wandered into a house at random and just did this. But what is the factor that flips somebody to get so obsessed and so violently obsessed, allegedly, against basically virtual strangers?
Yeah. Yeah, the obsessions would have started at least a decade earlier, I think, with violent fantasies, violent sexual fantasies, masturbating to violent pornography. I would really like to know the contents of his computer. Um, you generally find quite a trail of a fantasy life that's very active and very sexually violent. And then my guess is that because of his fascination and obsession with the topic, that's what drove him to study criminology. So it's
Hmm.
like the fantasies came first, and then the obsession with other killers and crime that came later. And then, well, how fun would this job be? We all want a job that we can be excited about in the morning, right?
Sure.
And for him, a person like this, thinking about working in crime was mood elevating.
Hmm.
It was kind of fun for him. Whereas most people who go into it are, can be really overwhelmed with the dark side and find it, it's like, gee, I don't want to hear another horror story. That was my reaction to it. I really burned out pretty quickly with wanting to know and being curious. It's like, I'm just tired of the subject. But a person like this would experience a mood enhancement from the darker aspects of humanity. So.
Assuming he's the guy that did this, and obviously innocent till proven guilty, but were these victims more so a representation of maybe what he didn't like, what they stood for, who they were? They were young, attractive, popular people that he
Yeah.
really never was. I mean, was this more so lashing out at what they represented versus who they may actually have been?
Yeah, very, very likely. There's usually a symbolic element in the way victims are chosen. And, people who commit serial sexual homicide have a type that they typically go for, whether they're short brunettes or tall blondes or curvy women or thin women. They've all got a preference, and that's their sexual fantasy. So it's probably a combination of having rage at women. A lot of times they are people who have been rejected, and so they simmer on that rejection and that anger. And women that he found sexually attractive and appealing. And then this sexual urge gets combined with the rage and the violent fantasies, and you get this really ugly outcome. And my guess with these particular people is that he was attracted to one or more of the women, had seen them around this community, which was a very small town, possibly had some kind of interaction with them, however briefly. It may not have gone well, or they may never have even noticed him or been aware of him. Guys like this will often stalk, and the victims don't even know that somebody's peeping in their windows or stalking them around town. They're completely oblivious to it. And so my guess is there was one or more of the girls that he had that kind of thing going with, the fascination, and then the other people who were present were just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Do you think that's what it comes down to with this case specifically, where it was something like that, where maybe his intention was just to go after one of them alone, and it happened to be he didn't expect that there's going to be other people there, another woman and her boyfriend, and this one of the girls' friends, the other roommate, and there's still two people. I mean, was this just a really horribly planned out crime that ended up, and I'm not trying to say this in a good way, but ended up working out for him, that he was able
Right.
to get in and get out the way that he did
Right.
without being taken down himself?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's it. He was, it was, if this was, as far as we know, the
Yeah.
first time this person had done this, then, you know, it's hard to put words to it, you know,
Hmm.
whether he felt lucky that it went as well as it did and he got away.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's absolutely nightmarish, and our hearts go out to those families of these incredibly wonderful young people who it just should not have happened.
Yeah.
The world of true crime never stops, and neither do we. Press subscribe now to get daily updates, in-depth analysis, and expert opinions from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.